is August the 12th, 1998. It's the 13th.
September 12th.
What did I say?
You said August.
Oh, this is September the 12th. This is September, August, never mind.
September 12th, 1998.
September the 12th, 1998. I put it wrong on this. Okay. My name is Charlie Henson. I'm with the 12th Armored Reunion here in Houston, Texas, and today I'm speaking to Mr. Norbert Bruemmer, and I appreciate your time today. Let's start out with when you were born, your parents' names, your mother's maiden name, and brothers and sisters.
Okay, on October 28th, 1915, Alois and Anna Arntz Bruemmer welcomed a new baby into their home in St. Louis, Missouri. And 3 days later, they took me to the St. Francis de Sales Church right up the street from the home, where I was baptized into the Catholic faith on the 31st of October, on Halloween, in 1915. And that was the start of my life. At that point in our family, I had two older brothers and an older sister. That was Irvin, Lawrence, and Mildred. Later on, my two more were born to the family, and that was my sister Frances and my brother Walter. He was the youngest in the family.
Okay. Where were your parents from? Did they come
They immigrated. My parents were born in this country, but my grandparents on both sides immigrated from Germany. And I don't know too much about my grandparents because they died when I was rather young. You see, my mother passed away, and I can always remember the date of her death because it was 2/22/22, all twos. She died of pneumonia back in February 22nd, 1922. And there were 6 of us children, 2 younger than I. In fact, at that time, my youngest brother was only 1 year old, and my younger sister was about 4, and I was 6. My dad tried to hold us together as a family, and he was successful until about November of 1922. He was a blue-collar worker, and he didn't have too much in the way of finances because he was a union member, and unions weren't too strong in those days. And he tried to hire a housekeeper, but of course, trying to get somebody to take care of 6 children is a little bit much. So in November of 1922, he placed all of us except my oldest brother in the German St. Vincent orphanage, where we were more or less raised by the Good Sisters of Christian Charity. My oldest brother was in the 8th grade, so my dad kept him at home because he was just about through school. So that's the way we pretty much started out. And we were sort of fortunate, even though you think of an orphanage as being some place where it's not a very tasteful place to be, but they treated us very well. We had 3 square meals a day. I recall we had to get up at about 5:30 every morning, and we'd wash in the washroom. Then we'd go to Mass at about 6 o'clock, and then we'd have breakfast after that. And after breakfast, we were assigned to our chores. We usually had an assignment for 6 months, particular part of the orphanage that we had to care for. You'd either be up in the dormitory sweeping the floors up there, the children made their own beds, or you'd be out in the hallway washing, mopping the hallways, or cleaning the steps up there where the kids would scrape their shoes and have shoe polish on the steps, and you'd have to scour that off, or clean the chapel floor. And every part of the home had somebody assigned to it. The children actually had the responsibility of caring for a certain portion of the home, and that was good for us too because we learned responsibility. And I stayed out there until about 1929, and at that time I finished grade school, and my dad decided to bring me home. And I came home in 29 and went to, he signed me, he enrolled me, I should say, in Missouri. They called it Missouri Business College, but it was really Missouri Business School, where I learned shorthand typing and bookkeeping.
And you were, how old at this time, 14?
I was about 14 years old when I came out of the home.
Okay.
In fact, I was less than that because I went into the home in November of 1922, and I didn't turn 14 until October of 1929. So I was really 13 when I came out of the orphanage. But then I went to Missouri Business School and learned shorthand typing and bookkeeping. And the first call that came through, they wanted me for a job, and I went to work for a calculating service company in downtown St. Louis at the terrific rate of $5 a week, which I came home and told my dad that I had a job, and he said, how much are you making? And I told him, and he said, that's not very much. And I said, well, yeah, Dad, but I got my foot in the door anyway. So I worked there for a couple of years, and then in 1933, there was a calculator salesman came through, and he told us that Owens, Illinois, up in Alton, Illinois, was looking for a man with my credentials, because I had learned to operate a comptometer, which I don't know whether you're familiar with or not. It's a calculator, manually operated, where you takes care of all the operations: addition, multiplication, subtraction, division. And the fact of the matter is, I was even teaching comptometry at the business place. Even though as young as I was, I became adept at it, so he had me teach the incoming students. So I went up to Owens, Illinois, which was located in Alton, Illinois, and that was probably one of the first trips outside the state of Missouri for me. And I went up there, and I was just a poor boy. I went up there, and I didn't have the proper attire for an office job. But I went up for the interview, and there were two of us standing there. One was for the office boy job, and the other was for a clerk in the office, which was my assignment. And the boss looked up, and he seen this boy applying for the office boy's job, and he thought he was the one applying for the clerk's job because he was more properly attired than I was. So anyway, I finally got the interview, and he wanted me to start in right away, and I said, well, I feel that I should give my old boss 2 weeks' notice because he's been very good to me. So he agreed to that, and then 2 weeks later I started in at Owens, Illinois as a bill of lading clerk. And I was replacing 3 people. It was a matter of taking shipping orders and calculating the the weight of each item against the pounds per package, because it was a glass container manufacturing company, and they shipped out via boxcars. So I started in on that assignment, and I worked on that for about a year, and then they decided that I possibly might transfer into the accounting department. So I started in accounting at that time, and then I always remember my father always telling me that one way to success is to always try to do a little more than you have to. In other words, always look forward to the man with the job a little higher than yours and see if you can help him with his work. So I attempted to do that, and after many years with Owens, Illinois, I was very successful. I was graduated to a supervisory job with Owens, Illinois, and I stayed with them for a number of years. And then in 1937, I was very, very fortunate in that I met a little country girl by the name of Fern, and she took my heart. I get a little single now. She did now. But, we got married in October of 1937, and excuse me just a minute. I didn't think I'd get sentimental talking about our marriage.
That's what's getting sentimental over.
Yep.
When you love somebody.
Well, she was a wonderful gal. And we started off life together. I mean, it was hard in the beginning because we didn't have any money. I certainly couldn't save any money out of that $5 a week, and I was giving $2 a week to my sister to help out at home. So I started in Owens, Illinois, and I started in at 50 cents an hour until the first payday came along. And then they put me on salary at $95 a month. And I thought that was a lot of money. And it was in those days. I mean, there was nothing taken out of your check, no taxes or anything. When you got your check at the end of the month, it was everything you earned. So I worked there, and then they gave me a deferment. When the war came along, I was in a supervisory position there in the accounting department. And Owens, Illinois manufactured these bottles that they put these little pills in, water pills that they used during the war, very small bottles, and they used to come in a case. I forget how many gross bottles were in a case, but they were huge cases, and they used to ship those out to the government, and they were part of the war effort, so they had a chance to defer anybody that they felt they needed. So I got one deferment, which was for about a year, and then when that time was up, they asked me if I wouldn't accept the second deferment. And I told them, I said, well, all of the young fellows my age are in the service. I said, I feel that I should go in. So in 1944, I entered the service. In March of 44, I was inducted, taken up to Fort Sheridan, Chicago, where I was inducted. And from there, I went down to Fort Knox for basic training. And of course, I went through the regular routine of hearing the boys yell out of the dormitory window, hey, they're going to get you with those square needles and what have you. So I passed through the line, and I went through the medical exams and the various vaccinations and so forth. And then we went in to take our various tests, and I took the what they call the AGCT test, Army General Classification Test. And when the scores came out, I was called into the company commander's office, and he asked me if my personnel records were correct. And I says, well, to my knowledge, they are, sir. And he says, well, you don't show anything on here about a high school education. I said, well, I never had an opportunity for high school. And he said, well, you scored 140 on the AGCT score. And he said, that's the highest in the company. So he said, I want you to go over. He said, it only takes 110 points to go to Officers Candidate School. I want you to go over and get an application for Officers Candidate School. I said, yes, sir. And he didn't order me, he just suggested it. So I walked out, and I thought, I don't want to make the Army my career. I got a job to go back to when I get back home. So I forgot about it. I went through basic training, and then they finally transferred me over to Armored Force Clerical School, where I took that program. And when I finished that, I came back to the company, and they had about a week of field training left. So they assigned me to a maintenance half track. And I went out with them, and the only incident I remember on that was they were taking field gunnery training, and they were on a high elevation, and the lieutenant came up to me and gave me what they call a cherry pistol, which was to fire flares, signals for the various guns to fire. He gave me no instructions whatsoever. He just gave me the pistol, first time I'd ever fired it, and he lined up the flares as to when he ordered a flare, I'd pick up the first one and put it in there and fire it. So I put it on a 45 angle. I fired the first flare, and he ordered the second flare, and I put it on a 45. A short period of time, it was very dry, and I seen a whole bunch of grass burning down in the distance. And here the fellows were laying out in firing positions, and here was a fire all around them. And Lieutenant came running over. He says, "What in the world are you doing?" I said, "I was just merely following your instructions." He said, "You don't fire a cherry pistol on a 45, you shoot it straight up in the air." I said, "I'm sorry, I wasn't told." So from then on out, it worked all right. But that was one of the catastrophes. But anyway, when we finished training, we were lined up at the company quarters on the street, and the captain called me out of ranks and asked me if I had gotten that application for OCS, and I said, no, sir. He said, well, I'm giving you an order right now to go over there and get that application. Yes, sir. So I went over and got the application, but unfortunately he didn't tell me to fill it out or anything, so I brought it back, took it home, tore it up, and threw it in the wastebasket. So I transferred from there to Camp Chaffee, Arkansas. That was just a replacement depot. And I then went from there up to Camp Barkley, Texas, where I joined the 12th Armored. And of course, with the Armored Force clerical training, I was called into Captain Shaw's office. I was assigned to a dog company of the 43rd of the 12th Armored Division. And Captain Shaw told me that I was going to be the new company clerk. And I said, well, sir, I understand you have a company clerk. And he said, well, he's no longer the company clerk because he spends all of his time writing editorials for his paper back home. So I was made the company clerk. And when I got there, they were preparing for overseas duty. And we company clerks went out to the field house where the Inspector General was putting us to assigning us to go over the records and make sure all of the information was in the records of all the people in the battalion. So we would work out there during the day, and then at night we'd go over and take care of our duties in the personnel section, making out morning reports and what have you, and filling in record data for our...
What's a morning report?
A morning report is something that each company makes up, telling of the day's activities. And during war, the morning report outlines all of the details of that day's activities. It tells if you're in battle, it tells the names of people that are sent to the hospital, if they're sent to an evac hospital, people that may be killed in action, and if you're sent to an evac hospital, it usually tells you what you were sent in there for and so forth. If I can deviate a little bit here, after the war, when I was secretary of the 12th Armored Division Association, a member of the 43rd who was in Baker Company called me from down in California and said that he had called the record center in St. Louis and made arrangements for them to get film tapes out for the period of, I think it was December of 1944 through May of 45 when we were in battle. And he wanted to get information on the people in the 43rd who might have been wounded in action. And from the morning reports, we could determine whether they went to an evac hospital and then perhaps trace from the evac hospital what happened to them to see if they might still be alive today or whether they died of their wounds. So we went there and we got copies of all the morning reports. They had a film there and microfilm, and we would just press a button whenever we wanted a copy of a report, and we made a copy. And I think we shipped in $22 for the copies, and it gave us a complete record of our battalion. But getting back to where I was before, we made out our various reports at night, and then of course by that time it was time to go back to the barracks and hit the hay and then start out the next morning the same routine. So we kept that up until I don't remember whether it was September of 44 that we packed up and we shipped up to Camp Shanks, New York. On the way up to New York, we had to type up payrolls because we company clerks would always prepare the payrolls and then go to the company area, and then we always paid in cash. We'd have to have each person sign a receipt for their cash that they received, and you take out their deductions that they had. Many of them had, I forget what they call them now, but it was an allotment is what it was, that they would send home to their wives or loved ones, and you'd have to deduct that and any other little incidentals that they had for laundry or such as that. There wasn't much left, because we were, as a private, I was making $50 a month, and I had a $22 allotment from my wife that left me $28 to exist on. But in those days, it didn't take too much money to exist. So I managed to get up to Camp Shanks, New York, and we were getting ready to go overseas, being called to duty. So while I was in Camp Shanks, I finally got a permit to go into New York City. And I thought, well, at least I'll be able to call the wife and tell her I'm on my way overseas. But it was just my luck.
Excuse me. Y'all were married and did y'all have children at this time?
Did I what?
Did you have children at home?
No, we had no children.
Okay,
No.
but you left your wife at home.
Mm-hmm.
Did she go live with her parents or did she stay?
No. Her parents were both dead by that time. Her mother died in 1939, 2 years after we were married, and her father died in 1940. No, I'm sorry, it was just the opposite. Her dad died in 1939, 2 years after we were married, and her mother died in 1941. So both of them were gone, and of course my two parents died in my early childhood.
Okay.
So
excuse me, you mentioned your wife back home. I was trying to get
sure.
Who you left behind?
That's fine, and incidentally, I was fortunate in that I was in a position at Owens, Illinois, where I knew a lot of the supervisors, and I was fortunate in getting her a job down at the plant. She went to work in a mold repair department. But in those days, we had two rate schedules, one for men, one for women. And if a woman was doing the same job as a man, her rate was lower than a man's. Now, thinking back in those days was that women weren't too dependable workers because they would go out and get married and have children, and they wouldn't have them on the payroll long. But thank goodness that's been rectified in more recent years. But anyway, she went to work then while I was in the service, and going back to Camp Shanks, we took our training up there. And when I went into New York City, lo and behold, they had a storm and flooding. And when I went into the railroad station to try to contact her on the phone, it was impossible because the water was all over. So I had to ship over without getting back in touch with her. But when she got something with an APO number on it, then I think she knew where I was. So we went over and we stopped in England first. We stopped in Southampton Harbor, and then we went into England, and I can't think of the name of the towns. I have them in that right up there. But we stopped at Tidworth Barracks. That's where we were stationed for first part of the stay over there. And then just before Veterans Day, at that time it was Armistice Day, we went down to load on the boats. And I can remember how it had rained and it was just complete mud all over. You take your shoes off and you just leave them in the mud and get in your cot. And the next day you'd stick your feet back in the muddy shoes and trot on down the line. And we did finally board the boat the next day, and we went across the strait to France, the English Channel. Went across the English Channel to France, and we thought we were going to land at Le Havre. But the channel was so full of wrecked ships and debris that they couldn't get in, so we had to go up the Seine River. And we finally got off and stopped at Offay, France. And we had to stay in the back of the trucks there until finally we found a farmer's home, a French farmer's home, and we stayed in his barn. We made our office, and one portion of it had a concrete floor, and at night, some of the fellows would go up in the hayloft and sleep up in the hayloft, and the rest of us put our bedrolls on the floor and sleep there.
Can I ask a question? What was the process, and how did y'all collect and store and get all those records? Did you take the records from Barclay? They followed you all?
Each of us had a record desk. It was about, I'd say, 2 feet by 2 feet by 2 feet square. And we had to lug that with us every place we went.
And you kept up with how many men specifically? Did you have a certain, was it the whole 12th or was it just the?
Each of us had our own company.
Okay.
We had the records of our company, and we were cautioned never to leave those records under any conditions because that would give the enemy some valuable information. And we were not to take notes to be used later up in making up a book or anything else. When I wrote that history of the personnel section, that was from memory because I couldn't take any notes as we went along. I had to think back and retrace our steps and put it down. But you had vivid memory in those days. You were younger and you remembered most of the things that occurred. So anyway, we finally got into France, and I remember at the first encounter that we almost had with the enemy was at Binding, France. We were all lined up on the road overlooking the town, and I had my gun and my ammunition, and I figured, well, I'm going to get my first experience at conflict. But pretty soon a motorcycle came down the road, and he stopped at the back of each truck and he said, "Any company clerks on here?" And of course I raised my hand. He said, "Get off." So they were opening a administrative center, and I'd have to look in there to find the name of the town because it escapes me now.
Letzelberg.
Let's see what's
Letzelberg. Right there.
Yeah, Lutzelberg, Lutzelberg, France. That's where the administration center was being formed, and that was on December 7th. Then on 5 January 45, we moved to Évricourt, France. It was considered a safer haven because of the Battle of the Bulge taking place about that time. So they moved us back so we wouldn't be captured. And then we moved from there. On 16 February 45, we moved to Château-Salins, France. We stayed there for about 2 days. And then on 18 February 45, we arrived in Falquemont, France. That was a town where I recall that we always experienced very, very cold weather in the morning, and by afternoon we were able to get out in the field and start playing softball. And there was a lot of French that were being brought back from the front lines. I mean, some of them were maybe prisoners that had escaped, and they're bringing them back home, and the people would be out there with food and what have you to give to them by our first sight of the conflicts of war. So it's an experience that always stayed with me. So then we left there, and on 26 March of 1945 we went to Diedesheim, Germany. That's about 90 miles from Falquemont. Approximately 1 week later we crossed the Rhine River at Worms, Germany, and pulled into the town of Bierfeld in Germany at night. Now that bridge over the Rhine River, it was a pontoon bridge. And while we were in France, I mean, you asked me a while ago about those field desks that we had. See, we had field desks, we had duffel bags, we had musette bags, we had our gun, we had our steel helmets, gas masks. We had all the equipment that the other soldiers had, but we had that desk to carry in addition to our typewriter. So what we did, they assigned us one truck for all the personnel department whenever we made a move. Well, by the time you pile that truck with all that equipment, all we could do was lay on top. And many times we were going down the road and there was an overpass, and our helmet was about that far from the bottom of the overpass. So in order to keep our head from getting knocked off, we confiscated a French vehicle. And we painted it olive drab. And I was given the task of making up a cardboard with the numbers cut out so they could put numbers on the car to make it look official with white paint. We painted the headlights black, with except for a little streak for night driving, blackout driving at night. And when I remember the move from Bierfelden to the Giedestad Airport. It was on the 11th of April in 1945. We were going down the road, and I looked ahead and I seen some shots. Looked like somebody was firing at a plane up above. And I told the fellows, "Hey, there goes some shells going up." We didn't realize that what it was a German plane raiding the column, and the shells were ricocheting off the road. So it didn't take us long to jump out of this small vehicle, and I jumped over a hedge, and it could have been a 30-foot drop-off on a 300-foot drop-off on the other side. I didn't know what was there. It was pitch black. But it was an embankment, and I rolled about 30, 40 feet. And then, of course, I right away straightened myself out in line with the road, because as he was strafing up and down the road, he'd have less chance of hitting me if I was in that position. I think 2 vehicles ahead of us, there were a couple of the men had been killed with the strafing, and there were quite a few wounded. So part of our personnel section that were in the vehicle in front of us, they helped take some of the wounded members to an evacuation hospital. And I understand that they even got fired on in the evac hospital. But we went on to Giedestad Airport. And there, of course, there were quite a few German planes that had been destroyed at the airport. And it was interesting for us to go around and look at the various German planes and inspect them. And, of course, each place that we went, we'd set up shop and continue our morning reports and what have you. We'd have to report on those that were killed in action and so forth. And at times...
How did you get the reports of killed in action? How did that get back?
That came back from the company quarters by a courier. And sometimes the sergeant would just prepare the morning report and send the morning report up. But the sad thing about it was that when you reported people killed in action, their small amount of belongings that they had would come to you, and you had a little bag that you put those belongings in to send back to the next of kin. And then shortly thereafter, we would get a letter from a mother or a wife asking us what happened. And that was the hardest part of my job. I just didn't know what to say to a mother, what happened to my son. Sometimes I really didn't know, but I'd try to find out. And it's one of the harrowing experiences you go through. I mean, communications is a difficult thing. But anyway, we satisfied them as best we could. That's about all we could do. So we went on, and of course, as the war started moving, the troops started moving rapidly. Of course, our outfit became the head outfit for Patton's move northward, being the mystery division. Why we had to take all the insignia off of our tanks, so the Germans wouldn't know what outfit we were. And the Germans called us a suicide division, because we were advancing so rapidly that we captured thousands and thousands of prisoners, because they were just taken by surprise. And the war was coming to an end, and we could see that, because as we went through the countrysides, we could see the Germany was losing all of its gasoline supplies and so forth, and they couldn't operate the motorized vehicles, and they were going to horse and cart to haul things. And we've seen many dead horses along the road that had been killed in action, and that was just the signs of war. And of course, you've seen I always felt sorry for them, the poor civilians that were plodding along the road to get out of the towns that were being shelled, something that people over here never experienced. And it got to me. I mean, they were German, but they were still just civilians, and they weren't involved. So I had a spot in my heart for them. And of course, my grandparents were German extraction, but that didn't deter me from being a true American. But I still felt sorry for any people that were involved in war. I'm a sort of a soft-hearted guy. So we went through all of that. We went to Uffenheim, Germany, Illesheim Airport, Fuchswangen, Germany, Steinheim, Germany, and then Heidenheim, Germany. That was toward the end of the war. And then the personnel section went under battalion control on 16th of May, 1945, and we set up in Ellwangen, Germany. And that was where I wrote my personnel section history portion of the 43rd Tank Battalion history. Then in September of 1945, I had to transfer out to the 2nd Armored Division. I didn't have enough points to stay with the 12th because most of the fellows had been in service about 2.5 years before I joined them in Camp Barkley, Texas. So I transferred to the 2nd Armored, and of course, seeing my MOS 405, which was a clerk, I was put to work typing up special orders. And the 2nd Armored was under regimental setup. They had a captain in charge of the personnel. And I worked at that assignment for quite some time, and then the 2nd Armored had orders to ship back to the United States. The captain called me in and said, "How many points do you have?" And I said 45, and I needed 50 to go back to the States with them. He said, "Were you ever up for any awards of any kind?" And I said, I honestly answered him, and I said, "Yes, sir, I was up for a Bronze Star with the 43rd, but no action was taken on it before I transferred out." And he said, "Well, go ahead and post a Bronze Star on your record." I looked at him and I said, "Sir, I can't do that. That's a court-martial offense." I said, "I just can't make a posting in the record." "Well, forget about it," he said. About a month later, I looked in there, and I guess he had prepared a special order and given me the Bronze Star. That gave me 5 points, and I was eligible then. I had 50 points rather, and I was eligible to go back with the 2nd Armored. So by that time, they had dropped the bomb on Japan. And of course, we originally were going to go back to the States and train recruits and then come back and go to Japan. So this, while we were on the high seas, the Congress reduced the discharge score from 55 down to 50, making me eligible for discharge. So the captain came to me and he said, "Bruemmer," he said, "would you consider going into the reserves or signing up for 3 more years?" And I said, "No, sir." Well, he said, "If you do," he said, "I'll make you the regimental sergeant major," which is the highest non-com rank on the post. He said, "I'll make you the regimental sergeant major, and you can bring your wife down, and we'll furnish you quarters on the post." Well, that was a very nice offer, but I had a wife to go back to, and I was sort of tired of the Army by that time. So I turned him down, and we got into, I think we went into New Jersey. I can't think of the port that we went into. And from there, of course, I had typed up the orders for the regimental battalion that I was with. And I knew that if I gave my address in Illinois, I'd be sent back up to Fort Sheridan, which is in the northern part of Illinois, and I'd have to come all the way down from there down to Alton, Illinois. So I gave my sister's address in St. Louis, Missouri. And that way I went to Jefferson Barracks, and I was very close to home there in Alton, Illinois, which is just 30 miles north of St. Louis. So anyway, I might go back just a little. When we were in Marseille, France, that was a port of debarkation, the dock strike was on up in New York, and we couldn't get boats to come home. So I spent Christmas and New Year's over in Marseille, France, rather than at home. So anyway, I finally got home. I don't remember the exact date or I arrived home, but I was discharged on the 6th of February of 1946. And then I took about a couple of weeks vacation, and I went back to Owens, Illinois then. And they put me back in the same job that I had, which was a supervisory job in the general accounting section. And I worked there until about, let me see, it was 1963. No, I'm sorry, it was 1950-something. They set up a cost control center. And the former manager of the accounting department asked me if I would go down with him to take over that responsibility. And I told him, I said, well, I've got 17 years here in the accounting department, and I said, I'm next in line for the job as head of the accounting department. He said, well, don't worry about it. He said, if such a move comes through, he said, I'll see that you get the job. In the meantime, I realized my lack of education. See, when I went in there, I had no high school education, which wasn't much of a requirement back in 1937, but it became more so as the years went on. So I decided I couldn't go to college because I didn't have the high school diploma. But after I got out of service, I found out that you could go down to Granite City and take a series of tests. I think it was 10 hours of tests. And if you passed those, you could go to the high school and take a civics exam. And if you passed that, you could get your GED certificate. So I did that. I enrolled for those tests, and I didn't have any trouble passing them because I had gone for non-credited courses at Shirtliff College, which was located in Alton. And I took some geometry there, which I never even knew the first thing about geometry, but I did manage to make a C grade, which was passing. So then after I got the GED certificate, I enrolled at Southern Illinois University and went to school at night because I was always eager for a college education, but I never could get it because I had to start to work. When I first went to work for Calculating Service, I was 15 years old, and I had to have a certificate from the city to allow me to go to work. And then I worked for the rest of my life. I had to help my family out because we were poor. So then I finally got with Southern Illinois, and I was working in accounting, and I had a lot of experience in accounting. I got in cost control work, and finally I got to a point where they were transferring people in from other operations, people that were plant engineers, and one was a divisional purchasing agent and so forth. They had no experience in accounting, but they had a lot of responsibility, and they were administrative men. So they were bringing them in, and I was working with them, and I gave them the insight on the accounting and cost control features. And then they would transfer out as plant managers to some of the other plants of Owens, Illinois. Owens, Illinois had plants all over the country. So I worked at that for quite some time, and I got to know quite a few people that I had worked with to give them the accounting experience. And finally the job opened up. They had two operations there. One was a glass container operation where they manufactured glass containers, and they had about 3,000 employees. And the other was the mold manufacturing, where they manufactured the molds for all the plants in the organization. Now, they were in a different division than we were. We were in glass container division. They were in what they call administrative division of the company. So they, at that time, both the Alton glass container plant and the mold manufacturing, they were both located in the same plant. They were both using IBM rental equipment because it was cheaper to rent equipment and take care of both operations rather than have each one with rented equipment. But then the glass container division decided they were going to go on computer. So I got the opportunity to become plant comptroller then. As a result of my studies at SIU, I was able to then become plant comptroller, and I was appointed to the job. And I had to sit down with the comptroller who was formerly in charge of the old accounting department and separate the two accounting departments. And I brought 74 employees with me to handle the Alton glass container plant. So that's the way we started out. And we finally got on the computer. We at first had to work on two two levels of operation. One, we would prepare all the input for the rental equipment, the IBM rental equipment, and run it through that, and then we'd process it through the computer, and we'd get the reports out, and we'd have to compare them to make sure we got the same results, to make sure the computer was functioning properly. But eventually we got fully on the computer, and then of course we were on the go. So I remained as a plant comptroller then for about 14 years until I retired in 1977. And at that time I had 44 years in with the company, which is unusual these days. You don't have that job security today. But anyway, I retired then, and after I retired, Jim, in fact, I have to go back. In 1963, my wife seen a piece in the paper about a 12th Armored Division reunion over in St. Louis at the Jefferson Hotel. And she said, "Norb, your old outfit's over there." And I said, "Is that right?" And she said, "Yeah, why don't we go over?" So I did, and I joined up as a member of the 12th at the time. And anyway, that was the start of my career with the 12th, and Jim Corcoran was at that time the unit rep for the dog company of the 43rd, and he asked me if I would take over. Well, I was somewhat reluctant, but my good wife, Fern, urged me on. She said, "I think you can do it, Norb." She said, "Why don't you go ahead? You do a lot of writing and so forth." So I said, "Well, okay." And I went to the reunion in 1978 in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And instead of being elected as just the unit rep, I was elected to the council as the unit director, representing all the tank companies in the division, in the battalion. So I started out on the council at that time, and I've more or less been on the council ever since. I was a unit director, and then I was elected as a director at large. And I didn't quite serve out my 3 years as a director at large when I was appointed as executive secretary and editor in 1982 in St. Louis. And I retained that office until 1987. I requested that the editing portion of the job be turned over to somebody else because it was getting to be a little much. So in 1987, my Bob Head took over as editor, and I remained as executive secretary until, well, it was the reunion in Charlotte, North Carolina. I had attended the January planning session of that reunion, but in September, or rather in August, my wife developed cancer in 1988. And by 1989, she was in very bad shape. Well, she was operated on for breast cancer, and they removed the lump, but they said it was malignant. And the doctor that performed the surgery just kept treating her for the incision and giving her exercises to recover. And they told her that the operation was successful and no treatments were necessary. A year later, after he had her under his supervision for 1 year, he then started taking x-rays, and they found out that the cancer had spread to her brain lining and was all through her body. And she survived for about a year after that. But on August the 11th, she fell and broke her hip. And she was in the hospital when Paul Hempfling, who was president at that time, called me to find out how she was. And I told him, I said, "Paul, I'm going to have to vacate the job of executive secretary because I said, I'm going to have to spend all my time with Fern." So I didn't see her, but my niece was standing there, her niece, I should say. And she told me, she said, "If looks could kill you, Norb, you'd be dead because Fern didn't want you to quit." But there was no choice. So this was in 1990 now. This was when the reunion was taking place in Charlotte, North Carolina. So I told him, I said, I'm going to have to vacate the job. And it was just before the reunion, and I had to send all my papers with a fellow that lived just a couple blocks from me that was going down to the reunion, John Casella, who's in the 134th. So he was gracious enough to take the papers down for me, and then Gilbert Heine, I guess you know him, he took over for me then as executive secretary because he was attending the meeting, and he agreed to accept the assignment for a year, but he held it for 2 years. So I was out of the association offices for that 1 year, but in the year 1991, they asked me if I would take over as chairman of the auditing committee. Bob Holweller was the auditor at that time, I mean the treasurer at that time, and he was on computer. And he had a stack of papers about that thick, he had everything on computer. So I took the job, and I had to conduct the audit by myself because the rest of the audit committee lived long distances away. So Bob Holweller sent me his records from Cincinnati, and I went through and conducted the audit, made the report at Omaha in 1991. And then in 1991, they decided they'd elect me as treasurer, and that's the job I've held ever since. So that pretty well brings things up to date. Now, as far as the action during the war, I think that's pretty much encompassed in the history that I prepared, which gives a little bit more vivid description of the route that we followed and so forth, and what we did in each town during the war. And I think that'll give you a little more information that I could convey in a short period of time.
Did you, did the clerks, did they ever get y'all close enough that y'all were under fire, or did they really careful about keeping all the records?
They kept us out of the line of fire as much as possible because of the value of the records. They didn't want these records to be too close to the lines. But as I stated there, you never knew what was going to happen. I remember one incident where we were on the road, and it must have been where we just went temporarily someplace because we didn't have all of our equipment with us. We were sitting on the truck seats, how they had these trucks and you had seats on two sides. I was the last man on the left rear of the truck. And of course we faced each other. On the other side of me, on the right rear of the truck, was the personnel sergeant major. And it was wintertime in Germany, and we had a heavy snow. The ground was completely covered, and you had trouble seeing the road, where the road was. Well, they made a turn off there onto another road, and I guess they turned a little bit too soon. The front wheels were on the road, but when the back wheel came along, while the right rear wheel was not on the road, and it went down into a ditch. Well, that caused my end of the truck to go up, and it threw me forward. And Sergeant Sillis, who was a regimental sergeant, I mean not regimental, but a personnel sergeant major, he felt the wheel going down. He jumped up from his seat, and my nose met the back of his head. I mean, I bled like a stuck pig. Fortunately, he was the only man on the truck that didn't have a steel helmet on. If he'd had a steel helmet on, I don't know whether my nose wouldn't be here today, I don't think. But anyway, they banged on the back of the truck itself, and finally they stopped, and the chief warrant officer came out, seen me bleeding back there, so he took me to the first town, and I stopped at the medical center, and they gave me 2 aspirins, and we went on. So that was the extent of that.
Yeah, that wasn't the $1 million wound, was it?
No. But as I say, our experience was not too interesting, but it was a part of the war effort, and it was a necessary part of it.
On this, I noticed that you talked about, you mentioned about a power of attorney or...
Oh, we had to make up power of attorney before we left the states for the various individuals.
Okay.
See, they would have power of attorney that they turn over to their wives or mothers or what have you, whoever they designated. And that was more or less a requirement in case you had to have any business transacted while you were overseas. So that was one of our chores, to type up powers of attorney and have them sign it, and so they could send it home to their folks. But we had a lot of varied duties as company clerks. It was more or less a matter of taking care of all the administrative affairs for your people. And then we would go up to the company area at payday and pay off the payroll, have the people sign for it. It was usually the company commander and the company clerk would sit there and they'd pass out the money to the people. We got overseas, well, it was a different matter. You had to convert the money into the currency of the land you were in, and that was always a job, getting it properly transferred over. But we made out. It wasn't that difficult.
If you were thinking about the war and you would think that somebody would see this tape in 25, 30 years, is there a message that you would want to leave with people about the war, about your experiences, or something?
Well, I think toward the end of that history I outlined that I hoped that the suffering and pain that had been endured during the war would be a lesson to people that nobody really wins in a war. I think that hopefully we will never again have a sizable conflict like we had in World War II, although there have been some that have been very sizable since, Vietnam and Korea and so forth. But none of them, there's no gain in any war for any country, and particularly the United States, because it seems that when we go in and conquer a country, they come out more economically strong than they were before, as Japan did, for example. We seem to go in and conquer a country, and then we make them economically sound. So it's almost a case that many countries have an incentive to go to war with the United States and lose the war so they can get back on their feet again. But it's a no-win situation, and I would hope that the present generation never has to go through the experience that we had to go through over there. And I don't think that the American people, having lived the kind of lives that they've lived, they've had more or less easy lives compared to people in other parts of the world. I don't think that they would be able to stand the horrors of war. I might misjudge them, but there's a lot of things that people have to go through that people over here have never experienced. And it's a sorry situation to see people suffering through the pangs of war. So I hope, for the sake of all the people in this country, that we never have to face that situation again.
Well, I appreciate your time today, and I think it's important for us to really get these things on tape and people to be able to see those later, and to learn some lessons about. So maybe it won't happen again.
I hope not.
I hope not.
I hope not.
Well, I appreciate it, and I appreciate these